Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and welcome to my December reflections. Today we're going to be talking about the decks I worked with in December of 2020, but we're also going to talk a little bit about the whole year and the whole idea of a depth year for 2020. So before we get into all of that, let's jump right into the decks that I worked with. So in the month of December, I actually had a lot of fun working with the Divine Muses Oracle. Now this is an Oracle deck that I really just got in the last couple months, and this is the first time that I've really had the opportunity to explore it in depth, and I actually found some really fantastic decks to pair it with. I do want to mention that the guidebook for this deck is fantastic, and I found it to be really key for tapping into the energy and the messages in each of the cards. And I really enjoyed reading about these individual archetypes, characters, muses. It was really wonderful, and I quite enjoyed reading the book. It's a tightly bound book, so it was a little bit hard to get into, but such a wonderful reference for working with this particular deck. And this is a book that I could see myself actually just diving into and reading because it's chock full of such interesting information. I really enjoyed the guidebook for this particular deck. So that was definitely a highlight for the month of just being able to explore this deck through the guidebook was really wonderful. So the first two decks that I worked with in December were the Darkness of Light Tarot and of course the Divine Muses Oracle. Now I found that these particular decks work really beautifully together, and actually because the way I tend to work with them is in a 3-card manner, let's just go ahead and take a look at this setup or this combination in the 3-card configuration, because that is primarily how my weekly readings go and the layout that I like to use. In this particular instance, what I was doing was using the Muse as my main sort of focus for the message for the week, and then letting the tarot cards sort of inform that message. And these decks just look absolutely beautiful together. They read really well. I think the kind of muted color palette between both decks works really beautifully as well. But in addition to that, the messages that came through working with these two decks together was really fantastic. So here we have the Two of Coins, the Mystic Rapture, and the Empress. I mean, how beautiful are these together? We see 3 really powerful women, each at home in their element. And to me, this is really telling me to kind of embody that and embrace that and to step into that sort of mystical, connected realm and help kind of bring that energy into more of the everyday world. And I think that's really beautiful. Again, these decks just, they look so pretty together, but really what it comes down to is how do they read together? Because sometimes decks that look really beautiful together on the table don't actually converse very well. But I really enjoyed the messages that I got through this particular pairing, and I love the way they kind of play off of each other. The figures are very central in both decks, so I really pay attention to the figures, what they're doing, what mood they kind of evoke. So that really helps to kind of create that sort of in-depth message. I mean, here we have Strength with the Totem of Water and the Knight of Cups. This is really talking about to tap into that inner strength, right? And I think that's really, really fabulous. So I'll just take a couple, flip through a couple of the cards. Again, they work really well together. I do love the sort of sepia tone nature of the Divine Muses, and that balances really well with the high contrast artwork that we see in the Darkness of Light. My Darkness of Light, I believe, is the 2nd edition. I do believe that the new edition is currently available. But again, look how beautiful here we have the High Priestess, the Muse of Dance, and the World. Lovely, just lovely. Oh, this is an interesting one. Our 9 of Cups and our Queen of Cups encasing the Totem of Fire. So really bringing that fiery energy into these watery cups. Very interesting. So again, just gorgeous. I could sit here and flip through these two decks together like all day. I think they're absolutely beautiful, and I really enjoyed working with them. So in the second week of December, I was working with the Hush Tarot and the Illuminated Earth Oracle. Now the Hush Tarot is a deck that I've actually been working on studying, and so it's kind of come up a couple of different times in a couple of different ways for me. I did really enjoy actually working with it for readings. I thought that was a really wonderful experience and a way to really help continue my work with that particular deck. There is just something about these two decks together. And again, I've done them in a 3-card layout because that is primarily how I actually worked with the decks throughout the month. But these two decks kind of feel like they were made to go together. They have a similar setup, a similar structure, and I feel like the Illuminated Earth really speaks to the core message that we're receiving, and it is expanding outward into the world of the tarot. So here we can see the multiverse, the magician, and the 4 of Wands. So really interesting messages that come through when we take a look at the Oracle deck kind of being like the real focus, the anchor for the message, and then everything else exploding or erupting out from there. So here we have the 9 of Wands, eruption, and justice. I mean, how beautiful. This particular 3-card reading would speak to a lot of energy moving forward, a lot of fire energy. Fire energy keeps coming up for me lately. That's definitely something that I personally need to be tapping into. But then we also have the card of justice here, which is really interesting, giving that idea of, you know, kind of be careful what you do with that fire energy. There's a lot of it going on. It's erupting outward, but justice is warning us to be mindful of how we're actually utilizing that energy. Just beautiful. And I love the artwork in both of these decks. I mean, oh, how gorgeous is this? So we have the 4 of Pentacles, the Underworld, and the 8 of Pentacles. So really interesting where we have 2 pentacles, a 4 and an 8. The 8 is the 4 doubled, right? So we have lots of stable energy going on here, and it's telling us, it's pointing us to the underworld. So it's telling us to dive deep into that energy, to really get beneath the surface of it and let that kind of help stabilize what's going on in our world. Just beautiful. The 10 of Swords with Harmony, and the Queen of Pentacles. I do have to say the Queen of Pentacles in this deck is not my favorite, and she is my personal significator card, so it's a little bit disappointing when she's not my favorite, but the rest of this deck I actually really quite enjoy, and so I'm willing to overlook those few little problematic cards. But just gorgeous messages coming through with this particular deck, this particular pairing. I really love the deep earthy nature of both of these two decks, and I think that the way that they converse together is really interesting. So here we have the 2 of Pentacles, responsibility, and the 10 of Wands. So real quick, I thought we would just swap the Illuminated Earth out for the Faceted Garden, which is the new Oracle by Claire Mack. And this is an absolutely gorgeous Oracle deck. I've been enjoying getting to know it because it is a new deck in my collection, but really similar to the Illuminated Earth. It works beautifully with this deck. This one really ties into kind of the more of like the tools or the energies available to us to kind of support us on our path. That's just my own kind of personal interpretation of how I'm kind of finding this deck to be evolving for me. I do really love it. I do intend to probably use the 2 of them together and combine them, but I wanted to really have a chance to get to know the Faceted Garden first. And here we have the animal allies, and in both of these cards we of course have animals and birds. So that's really interesting, and maybe this is telling us to really tap into that bird energy. So that's another really beautiful combination that I really enjoyed working with. That's the Hush Tarot with the Illuminated Earth Oracle and the Faceted Garden Oracle. So the next week I was back to working with the Divine Muses Oracle because I really just wanted to explore it more in depth. And this time I paired it with the Pagan Otherworld Tarot. And this was an absolutely stunning combination. So again, looking at the beautiful 3-card combination, I have put the Divine Muses in the middle again, and then allowed the Pagan Otherworlds to expand upon that message. So here we have the Muse of Tragedy with the 5 of Wands and the Page of Cups. You know, really interesting how these 2 cards really kind of speak to sort of conflict, and then yet we have the Page of Cups who's very open to receiving. That's always really interesting when you see kind of those really heavy on one side, and then you have the 3rd card that really just kind of opens it all up. So here we have the 7 of Wands with the Muse of Comedy and the Queen of Pentacles. Beautiful. Again, we have a similar kind of color palette that I think works really well. The Divine Muses almost feels a little bit darker and heavier in comparison to the Pagan Otherworlds, which is a little bit more, it's very earthy, but it also feels very much in the air for me, in the realm of mind, in the realm of air. So I think that really balances out beautifully with the Divine Muses. They speak really well to each other. Here's an interesting one: the Chariot, the Great Mother, and the Lovers. So sitting between the Chariot and the Lovers is the Great Mother. How beautiful is that? I honestly wasn't sure what I was going to think of the Divine Muses because it is a collage deck, and sometimes those kind of miss the mark for me, but I do really love the collage work that's been done in the Divine Muses. Here's another interesting combination. So we have the Devil and the Knight of Pentacles, and sitting in between is the Sky Father. Interesting readings coming from these decks. Another beautiful one, the Hierophant, the Empress, and between those is the Magical Child. So in this particular instance, these 2 decks together feel like the Pagan Otherworlds is kind of pulling in or leading us to the energy of the Muse, the Divine Muses Oracle. So in each combo, every time I do these 3-card combos with these 2 particular decks, I do feel like that rather than the Divine Muses being kind of the center focus and expanding outward as I normally see it, I actually see the Pagan Otherworlds, the 2 cards from the Pagan Otherworlds, actually kind of closing in on the message or the energy of the Divine Muses. And it's a really interesting kind of reverse effect where rather than expanding outward, the message is actually kind of coalescing inside, and it's bringing those 2 elements together to create this central message. So I really find that interesting, and I found a lot of times that, as you can see here, the cards actually directionally indicate looking at this card in the center. So here we have the 2 of Swords and the Star, which are coming into the Muse of Astrology. I mean, just beautiful, just beautiful. So again, another 2 decks that I really had a wonderful time exploring throughout the week, and that is the Pagan Otherworlds, which I paired with the Divine Muses Oracle. So in the 4th week of December, which was actually the week of Christmas, I was working with the Revival Art Tarot. Now this deck I worked solely on its own, and I didn't pair it with anything because it is a new deck to my collection, and I really wanted to get a chance to get to know it without adding any extra elements or energies to it as you know, in terms of an oracle or pairing it with another tarot. So really I was just focusing in on the messages that I was receiving from this particular deck. And I do have to say that I really enjoyed working with it. I do quite love the artwork in this deck. It is absolutely stunning. The production value is wonderful. I did do a walkthrough not too long ago on my channel, so I'll be sure to leave that linked in the description box below if you want to check it out. But this is an absolutely beautiful deck, and I really found that the messages were quite profound and a lot kind of softer than I really thought they were going to be. It was really a gentle deck throughout the week, and it was kind of just a wonderful, soft and supportive deck to kind of, help through the holiday seasons. Because of everything going on in the world, the holiday season was a little bit different this year, not quite like it normally is. And so I really felt like this was a really wonderful deck to kind of just tap into that kind of a little bit more supportive, softer energy. I didn't really expect this to be a soft deck or to be a really nurturing or supportive deck. And I'm actually quite pleased to find that it is, and that is the way it was reading for me. I'll be curious to see if it continues to read that way for me, or if it was just reading that way for me because that's really what I needed in the moment. But this is an absolutely stunning deck. The production value is fantastic, and I really enjoyed reading with it and working with it throughout that whole week. So this was a deck that just seemed really well suited for the particular season and the week that I used it in. It was very nurturing, very supportive, and I think that was something that I really needed that week. So it worked quite well, and that is the Revival Art Tarot. So in the last week of December, the last week of the year, I really was just having some fun mixing and matching these decks together. I found they actually all worked really well together. I would kind of use the Divine Muses to provide sort of my focal point for the reading, and then allowed the reading to expand into the cards from the Darkness of Light, the Revival Art, and the Pagan Otherworld. They're all very different decks, but I found they actually all read really well together. It's a really interesting combination when you start mixing in all of these different art styles. We definitely have a cohesiveness, I think, in the sort of energy of the deck. These are all decks that I would kind of consider my wintry decks, and they're decks that I tend to pull this time of year. Pagan Otherworlds is a little bit more into the fall for me, but I just hadn't had a chance to use it during the fall, and I was just really feeling called to use it, and I thought it would pair really beautifully with the the Divine Muses, which of course it did, and I was really glad that I took the time to go ahead and do that. One of the things that was really interesting, we can see represented here, the Darkness of Light has a couple of like pinks and pastel colors that we don't tend to see near as much in the other decks, and so it's really interesting when one of those would pop up and just really draw your attention, whereas these other three decks are a bit more on the muted side. I mean, the Darkness of Light definitely has a muted undertone to it as well, but sometimes you just got that big pop of that pink background or something, and it would really draw your eye. So again, just a really interesting but gorgeous decks that kind of all work well together, and I really had a lot of fun just playing with them all and seeing kind of how they spoke to each other, how they interacted, and what messages I was able to pull out of all of them. So the last deck that I worked with, or the deck that I worked with all throughout the month of December, was the Moonchild Tarot, and this was the deck that I used for my self-care readings. Now this is a deck that I use quite often for self-care readings. I love the way this deck reads. I love the artwork for the most part. There are a few cards in here that are a bit problematic for me, but for the most part, I really love the way that this deck works for me. Again, it's another really supportive deck, a really nurturing deck, and so it's one that I definitely tend to pull into my self-care readings, but it also has a very grounded nature to it, a little bit more so that I feel than, like, say, the Star Child, and so this one is a really wonderful one for me to use when I'm feeling a bit like things are a little bit chaotic and I do need that grounding energy, which was definitely how I was feeling throughout most of December. So this is a wonderful reader for me. It's a wonderful deck for self-care, and I really enjoy working with it. I do have really detailed videos about how I work with this deck if you're interested in finding out more, so I will leave a link to that in the description box below. So not only did I work with some really great decks in December, I also worked with some decks that kind of surprised me after I kind of got to know them a little bit better. So now let's kind of talk about the year of 2020. What do we say about 2020? Bye-bye, so glad you're over. That's what I have to say. At the beginning of 2020, I had planned on doing a depth year, and that is where you kind of really set some ground rules for yourself about the things that you kind of want to accomplish throughout the year, the things that you really want to go deep with and focus in on. Now, it kind of started as like a consumer experiment, so to speak. And I do have links in that original video to some of those other videos that talk a little bit more about what a depth year is and where it came from. But the basic idea behind it was to kind of spend less and focus on the things that you already had. That was the original kind of intention. But it's also become kind of like this movement that's taken place not only in our community, but in the larger world as a whole, which I think is pretty wonderful. So for me, I had intended on doing a depth year in 2020, and it started out pretty dang good. I did a couple of recaps, I think a 3-month and a 6-month. I kind of missed my 9. I'm not even sure I did a 6. I'd have to go back and look. The intention was always there, but as the year wore on and as, the pandemic really kind of ramped up and really started making a big effect in the world, I really kind of fell off the wagon. And I know I did a video about falling off the depth year wagon because kind of the first few months of the pandemic, things were completely out of sync around here, and nothing was normal. Nothing was normal, right? We all know that. And so I did some retail therapy, and my choice for retail therapy is often decks, journaling supplies, and books. Those are kind of my 3 things that I not only do I retail therapy with, but also just things that I'm very passionate about. So I did buy a bunch of decks. It happened. That's okay. The world is kind of a crazy place, and you got to do what you got to do to get through in the time. So I kind of fell off the wagon, and I don't know that I ever really got back on it. My deck spending, which was only really one little part of my depth year, really did kind of just, I think, naturally kind of slow down. And that's mostly because I started to realize that for the most part, I have all the decks that, for one, I could possibly ever use, and 2, that I really wanted or needed. And so my wish list, so to speak, or my deck buying list had really kind of dwindled down. Part of that was because I had bought a bunch of the decks that I originally wanted, and part of it was because as I was kind of working through the decks I already had and looking at the decks I already had, I really started to realize that there are several decks in my collection that I don't use, or several decks in my collection that were really similar to things that were on my wish list. So I spent a little time throughout the year kind of going through my deck collection. I have sold some decks, I've traded some decks, I've got some decks set aside that are kind of still in their little limbo mode because I'm not sure if I'm going to keep them or not. And I've really honed my wish list down to just really a handful of decks that I feel like would really bring something to my tarot practice. I do still impulse buy. I do still retail therapy shop. In fact, I impulse bought 2 decks this month, and that's okay. I had seen them. I had talked to a friend who had liked them and enjoyed them, and I thought, I'm going to go ahead and get them and give them a try. They were mass market decks, and I'm a little bit more prone to impulse buying a mass market deck than a indie deck, just because, the price point. I feel like for $20, if I really don't like it, it's okay. I can pass it on. The one deck that I did finally succumb to total deck FOMO was the Oak, Ash, and Thorn. So a couple of different things. I'd seen this deck around, right? I've even posted in my Facebook group about how I was having total FOMO over this deck, and I think that was October, November, something like that. It might have been November. But I was really feeling like, I was just missing out by not having this deck. And I was watching walkthroughs and unboxings, and I just was like, I have FOMO. So kind of admitting that in my Facebook group was helpful, because that kind of like got it out of my system. I was like, okay, I have FOMO over this deck. And then I was asking, what other people have FOMO over, the fear of missing out. And I was good. I was totally good. But then I started seeing it again. And then I had a fantastic reading with Kelly from The Truth in Story, and it was one of her birth chart and kind of elemental astrological readings. And it was a really, really wonderful reading, very insightful, super spot on. And a couple of things that she had mentioned in that reading were, of course, she'd used the oak, ash, and thorn. That was kind of where I was going with this. I lost my train of thought there. She'd used the oak, ash, and thorn. And I was like, I feel like this is a sign because I've been putting this deck off. I then watched some more walkthroughs, and I talked to Lisa about it because I know she has it, and she was like, yes, you need that. What's wrong with you? So I did go ahead and pre-order the, I think it's whatever edition is coming next. I think it's the second, but I went ahead and pre-ordered it. I think they said it's supposed to release sometime mid-February, so I'm really excited about that. But I do feel like that one was one that the universe was kind of like nudging me towards, like encouraging me to get. And in particular, it kind of cemented it for it when I got my reading from Kelly and she used that deck. And some of the things that she pointed out in that reading, first of all, were just entirely spot on. And second of all, really kind of related to the deck that she was working with, right? There was a lot of fox energy in my reading. And so that got me kind of down the foxhole rather than rabbit hole, total intentional pun there. The foxhole or the rabbit hole of kind of looking into fox energy, because fox is not something that I have worked with before. I'm very new to working with animal energies anyway. That's definitely something that's only come into my practice in the last year or so. And so I started kind of looking into fox energy, in particular red fox, because those were the foxes that kept showing up. Kelly also had mentioned a book in my reading that she was currently reading, which she later did a video on, which was fantastic, called The Lost Spells. And in that there is a poem about or from red fox. And so she included that in my reading, which was really wonderful. And it really kind of got me to thinking about this whole red fox energy. And so, of course, I had to buy the book as well. So that's definitely something that's going to be integrated into next year's work. I even used the reading kind of as a jumping off point or a starting point for my 2021 tarot journal, which was a lot of fun. I'm really excited to show you guys all that as well, because I am switching things up a little bit. I switch things up a little bit every year just to kind of keep things fresh and interesting. But anyway, I really felt like the fox energy was really calling to me, and I really felt like the universe was kind of like just nudging me in the direction of Oak, Ash, and Thorn. And so I did finally pre-order it. So it is on its way, hopefully in February, and then I can start working with that deck. So the whole deck purchasing thing aside, because that was really only one little piece of the puzzle for what I intended for my depth year. What I had really intended to focus on was really creating a deeply personal practice and expanding my knowledge. So that was a key element. I mean, yes, buying less decks and diving deep into what I already had was a focus, and that definitely is continuing for me into 2021, perhaps even more so, because I feel like I said, I'm really at the point where I'm pretty happy with the decks that I have. And I really want to dive deeper into them and explore them more, and also kind of weed out the ones that I don't necessarily need or am just not working with, because they should go to somebody who will enjoy them and will work with them. And so I definitely have a few of those kind of set aside that I'm already thinking need to probably find new homes. But I have a lot of decks, and I really want to be able to connect with and utilize the decks that I have. I don't really consider myself like a tarot collector, because I try to actually use all the decks. I have very few decks that are set up and are like pieces of a collection that I don't touch. And those are, well, even those I touch on occasion, so that's not entirely true. I just like to have a big variety of decks at my disposal. I like to think of it as a deck for every mood, a deck for every season, and a deck for every purpose. That's kind of how I look at it. And when I find decks that kind of check one of those boxes, then I'm okay with bringing that into my collection. But I've become really aware of decks that kind of have a similar theme or place or purpose in my collection, and those are the ones that I'm kind of at the point of I'm trying to kind of determine which of those I want to keep, because I don't need 4 decks that all serve the same purpose in my collection. I just need 1 or 2 is great, and I'm comfortable with that. Too much more and I start feeling a little bit of deck overwhelm, which is a very real thing. So anyway, back to what my original intentions were for my depth year. Really, I just wanted to kind of dive deep into some particular areas of study, which I feel like for the most part, I really have done. So 2020, yeah, I mean, it was a year, right? I guess it was a year that we will all never forget. But I am definitely excited to leave it behind and to move into a new year and hopefully some better things for the world as a whole. That would be wonderful. I definitely have had to examine some of my own personal structures and practices. So I'm definitely looking forward to kind of maybe settling into this new way of being. And of course, you know, looking forward to better things on the horizon. I have a lot of stuff planned for my channel for 2021. I have some series that I'm going to be doing, some longer series, some more in-depth series. I have some books that I'm going to be releasing, fingers crossed. And I'm also going to be experimenting with some live events. We'll see how that goes. But I think it's going to be a fun year. It has to be better than 2020 was, right? It just has to. So anyway, I hope that you had a wonderful December and that you survived 2020. And I wish you many blessings moving into this beautiful new year.
Thank you for joining me today. You will find links for everything featured here in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.